And then we have Gary Weber, who is a lecturer and author. And Gary has a book out. I haven't got a copy, but it's called Happiness Beyond Thought, A Practical Guide to Awakening. So, we're going to start our discussion. I'm looking at you, Gary. I'm drawn to you to start with. What is enlightenment for you? I like putting people on the spot. So,
well, enlightenment for me is what Ramana Maharshi defined. And Ramana Maharshi, and Tanjali Yoga Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Tao Te Ching, which is to have no thoughts. I started out trying to get rid of my suffering. And my observation was that my suffering was caused by, my body was very healthy, I had a good situation, but it was all mentally driven, and it appeared to come from these thoughts. So I set about empirically trying to find a way to somehow ameliorate this suffering I was receiving from these thoughts. And I just hunted around empirically and worked on that process and came across Ramana's teachings and teachings of a fellow named Basui, who was a 14th century Zen monk. Same thing, where am I, who am I, what am I, what is this? And eventually, worked. Thought stopped.
does that mean you're enlightened?
I think pedagogically, that's a not useful term. I mean, if I say, you're enlightened, or whatever, I mean, it freezes you in place. Then you become something. You have an egoic structure built around, I am enlightened. So to me, it's not useful to have that term around, and people struggle for it. It's not an Olympic gold medal you get once. To me, enlightenment is a never-ending process. Radha Roshi, one of the great teachers at the end of the 19th, 20th century Zen, said enlightenment is capable of endless enlargement. And that's been my experience. I mean, it just keeps opening and deepening and getting stiller and stiller and stiller.
But what do you actually feel? What's your feeling? Is it a feeling of freedom?
There's just
or
this
delight, or softness, or what's the feeling?
It's very, very still, but there's a sweetness to it. And we've looked at, how do we get this sweetness maintained? Or it's my state virtually, 95% of the time, of course, of the day. It's just very still. Yet I can still pass for being functional, but there must be some way the brain has found to maintain this state. It turns out, in my experience, that the brain loves this state. It wants to be in this state, and it gets more and more still around that. And so perturbations out of that, some kind of experience comes along, or some kind of a attraction, the brain does not want to go there. As much as you can anthropomorphize into what the brain's doing, the brain wants to stay here. So there's no effort. It's a natural, for me, a natural state. Sahaj, Nirvikalpa Samadhi. It's naturally, if you're just in this great stillness. And life comes and goes. You dance through it. There's no free will, nobody in control. And it's the best game in town. And yet you still, I say, you can pass for being functional.
And one other question. When you say it's a never-ending process, in which direction is it going?
Yeah, I don't sense a direction, although we talked earlier that people I work with, there's some point at which they begin to feel that, hold it now, I'm not in control any longer. I mean, it's obvious that there's something afoot, something happening here that's has taken charge of the process. And it looks like the I gets smaller and smaller, less apparent as a single entity, and less constitutive. And so then what happens is the brain seems to take over the process because it likes this state, and it just takes over. And it actually, you give it enough data points, enough snapshots of this stillness, and it will functionalize around it. It will change its functional pattern to support that. So it becomes natural.
Paul, you're nodding. What's your thoughts as you listen to Gary?
So Gary, how was your process? How did you reach this point of stillness?
Well, I think the big difference is recognition that every place I had an attachment, there was an I there. And some I that was coded into that particular attachment. So I went around systematically and through a lot of different processes looked at any place I was attached, anything anything I was attached to. And I did a surrender process. Could you let go like this? Would you let go of it? When Byron Katie's stuff. And eventually, I kept feeling around and feeling around and feeling around for attachments. And as near as I could ascertain, I didn't have any. Because every time I had a thought, a self-referential thought, obviously there's an I there because it is self-referential. And so you go to it and you say, well, this particular thought, who did it come to? And what's the attachment that lies underneath this thought? And we have many, many I's. If you watch yourself go around the course of a day, every person you meet, a different I will manifest. You will change as you go from person to person. So you can keep rolling back into and getting rid of all your attachments. When you get rid of all your attachments, and to me it came down to a final big surrender, which was, I will put everything on the table. I mean, I surrender to whoever, the universe, Ramana Maharshi, everything. And if I have to die, literally, to understand the truth, then I will accept that. And so I did that. And soon thereafter, turned.
So when you say, how can you describe the turn?
Well,
Was it an experience, or what did you perceive after the turn?
Well, I was doing a vinyasa, a series of yoga postures that I'd done many times. I was doing an asana that I'd done literally thousands of times before. I had 20,000 hours of practice, yoga and meditation. And I went up into it one way, and when I came down, everything, thoughts had stopped. This was a problem because I had 1,000 people working for me at that time, and a $250 million budget in 4 research laboratories, and I had, because of yesterday, I had no thoughts. So this was kind of a feeling arose that now you've done it.
Now you blew it.
Now you've done it. But